Millionaire elderly couple was kicked out by their own son. But what happened 10 years later shocked everyone. Get out. The words hung in the air like poison. You're not welcome in this house anymore. Bernard Chen stood in the doorway of what had been his home for 37 years, his hands trembling as he held a single suitcase. Beside him, his wife Yvonne gripped a worn canvas bag, her elegant posture finally crumbling under the weight of her son's cruelty. "Julian, please," she whispered, "we have nowhere to go." Their son, their only child, the boy they'd sacrificed everything to raise, crossed his arms over his expensive suit. "That's not my problem. You signed the house over to me 5 years ago. It's mine now, and I want you gone." "But we had an agreement," Bernard protested, his voice cracking. "We gave you everything so you could expand the business, but we would still live here. Agreements change. I'm selling this place. The new owners take possession in 2 weeks. You need to be out by then." Julian's eyes were cold, empty of the warmth they'd once held. "Actually, I'd prefer if you left today." Behind Julian, his wife Stephanie appeared, her designer dress probably worth more than Bernard and Yvonne's monthly pension. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Julian said smoothly. "I'm just explaining to my parents that it's time for them to find their own place." Stephanie's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, good. I was worried they might make a scene. The realtor is showing the house tomorrow, and we can't have clutter." Clutter. That's what they'd become. 2 people in their 70s who'd built a successful importing business from nothing, who'd worked 18-hour days to send their son to the best schools, who'd mortgaged their future to fund his first company. Clutter. Bernard had made the mistake, the terrible, trusting mistake, of signing over the house and the business to Julian 5 years ago. The accountant had suggested it for tax purposes and estate planning. Julian had promised nothing would change, that they'd always have a home, always be taken care of. They'd believed him. Now, standing on the front steps of their own home with 2 small bags containing the remnants of their lives, Bernard and Yvonne Chen faced a truth that no parent should ever have to confront. Their son didn't love them. Perhaps he never had. Perhaps they'd been nothing more than a means to an end. "Where will we go?" Yvonne asked quietly. Bernard looked at his wife, his partner of 48 years, and tried to find words of comfort. But there were none. They had $847 in their bank account. Their pension wouldn't start for another month. They had no other family, no safety net. They had nothing. "I don't know," Bernard admitted, "but we'll figure it out, together." The door to their home, no, to Julian's home, closed with a finality that echoed in their bones. They spent that first night in a homeless shelter. The intake worker, a kind woman named Maria, processed their information with professional compassion. "How long do you think you'll need to stay?" "Just a few days," Bernard said, trying to maintain his dignity, "until we can make other arrangements." But both he and Yvonne knew the truth. At their age, with no assets and limited income, other arrangements might never materialize. The shelter was clean but grim. Rows of cots in a large room, the smell of industrial detergent mixing with human desperation. Around them were the forgotten people of the city, veterans, addicts, families who'd fallen through society's cracks. Now, Bernard and Yvonne were among them. That night, lying on adjacent cots in the darkness, Yvonne reached across the gap between them to hold Bernard's hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" "For trusting him, for believing blood meant loyalty." "We both believed," Yvonne said softly. "Parents are supposed to believe in their children, even when the children don't deserve it?" Yvonne was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the shelter breathed with snores and whispers and the occasional sob. "I don't know anymore." The weeks that followed were a brutal education in survival. Bernard and Yvonne discovered a world that existed parallel to the comfortable life they'd once known, a world of food banks and day labor, of cheap motels when they could afford them and shelter beds when they couldn't. Bernard found occasional work loading trucks at a warehouse. The manager took pity on him, though the physical labor left him exhausted and aching. Yvonne cleaned houses for cash. Her arthritic hands pushed past their limits as she scrubbed toilets and floors. They were invisible now. People looked through them, past them, as if poverty had erased their humanity. But they had each other, and somehow that was enough to keep going. 3 months after Julian kicked them out, they managed to rent a tiny studio apartment in one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. It was on the 4th floor of a building with no elevator, and the walls were so thin they could hear their neighbors' every argument and movement. But it was theirs, or at least they paid rent for it. The apartment was a single room with a kitchenette in one corner and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. They bought a used futon from a thrift store and 2 folding chairs. A small TV from the 1990s sat on a milk crate. These were their possessions now. "Do you remember our old living room?" Yvonne asked one evening as they ate ramen noodles from paper bowls. "The antique furniture your parents brought from Hong Kong." "Julian sold it all," Bernard said quietly. "I saw it listed online. He got $45,000 for your grandmother's cabinet alone." Yvonne set down her bowl, no longer hungry. "And he couldn't spare even a fraction of that for us." It was the grief that hurt most. Not the physical hardship, not the poverty, but the grief of losing their son. Or rather, of discovering they'd never truly had him. Bernard often wondered, where had they gone wrong? They'd loved Julian, supported him, sacrificed for him. They'd been proud when he took over the business, even prouder when he expanded it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But somewhere along the way, success had corroded Julian's soul. Money had become his god, and anyone who couldn't contribute to his wealth, even his own parents, was disposable. 6 months into their new life, Yvonne collapsed at work. The woman whose house she'd been cleaning called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors discovered severely high blood pressure and warning signs of heart disease, conditions that had gone untreated because they couldn't afford insurance or regular checkups. "She needs medication," the doctor told Bernard, "and rest, lots of rest." "How much will the medication cost?" The doctor consulted his notes. $300 a month, approximately. Bernard felt the number like a physical blow. They barely had $300 for rent and food. How could they afford medication, too? But looking at Yvonne in the hospital bed, pale and fragile, he knew he had no choice. He'd find a way. He'd always found a way. He picked up extra shifts at the warehouse, working 14-hour days despite his own aging body's protests. He skipped meals to save money. He walked everywhere to save bus fare. And somehow, they survived. 1 year after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne were still in their tiny studio apartment. They'd learned to navigate their new reality. Which food banks had the best donations? Which churches offered free meals on which days? How to stretch $1 until it screamed. They'd also learned something else. There was dignity in survival, in choosing to keep going despite everything. In finding small joys, a sunset viewed from their 4th-floor window, a library book shared between them, the simple comfort of each other's presence. "I don't hate him," Yvonne said one night out of nowhere. Bernard knew immediately she meant Julian. "I do." "Hate takes energy. I don't have energy for hate anymore," Yvonne was quiet for a moment. But I don't understand him. I look back at his childhood, at the boy he was, and I can't reconcile that with the man who threw us away. Money changed him. Or maybe it revealed who he always was, Yvonne said sadly. Maybe we just didn't want to see it. There had been signs, Bernard admitted to himself. The way Julian had treated service workers with contempt, his obsession with status symbols, the distance he'd maintained from them even before he kicked them out. Too busy for family dinners, always on his phone during rare visits, treating them like obligations rather than people he loved. They'd made excuses. He's ambitious, they'd said. He's focused on success. He'll soften when he's older, when he has children of his own. But Julian and Stephanie remained childless by choice, and had only grown harder, colder, more ruthlessly focused on acquisition and status. 2 years after being kicked out, Bernard suffered a minor stroke. He was at the warehouse when it happened, a sudden numbness in his left arm, his vision blurring. His co-workers got him to the emergency room in time, and the doctors managed to minimize the damage. But the message was clear. His body was breaking down under the strain. "You can't keep working like this," the doctor told him bluntly. "Your body needs rest." "I'll rest when I'm dead," Bernard replied. The doctor didn't laugh. "That might be sooner than you think if you don't slow down." But how could he slow down? They needed money, for rent, for food, for Yvonne's medication. Rest was a luxury they couldn't afford. Still, the stroke forced changes. Bernard had to reduce his hours at the warehouse. Their income dropped. They fell behind on rent. For a terrifying month, eviction loomed over them like a guillotine blade. They'd survived being kicked out by their son, only to potentially lose their home again, this time to economic reality. Then Maria from the homeless shelter, the intake worker who'd processed them on that first awful night, appeared at their door. "I heard you were struggling," she said. "I have something for you." She handed them an envelope. Inside was $1,200 in cash. "We can't accept this," Bernard protested. "It's not from me. It's from a donor who helps shelter clients transition to stable housing. I put in a request on your behalf." Maria smiled. "You've been dealt a tough hand. Let someone help you." The money kept them housed. But more than that, Maria's kindness reminded them that not everyone in the world was like Julian. Some people still cared, still helped, still saw them as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. Wait before their fate changes forever. If this story of love and danger has already captivated you, comment which character intrigues you the most. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected twists, subscribe and join our storytelling community. The most intense chapter is about to begin. Now, back to the plot. 3 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne found an unexpected community. Their neighbor across the hall, a young single mother named Layla, started leaving food at their door. Nothing fancy, just extra portions of whatever she'd cooked. A Vietnamese family downstairs shared their garden vegetables. An elderly war veteran taught Bernard card tricks to pass the time. These people had nothing, yet they shared what little they had. "Why do you think that is?" Yvonne asked Bernard one evening. "Why do people with the least seem to give the most?" Bernard considered the question. Maybe because they understand. They know what it's like to need help, to be invisible. "Julian has never understood need," Yvonne said quietly. "Everything was always given to him. He never had to struggle." It was true. They'd shielded Julian from hardship, wanting to give him a better life than they'd had. But in doing so, had they failed to teach him empathy? Failed to show him that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege? Maybe, probably. But it was too late now for regrets or recriminations. 4 years after being kicked out, Yvonne started volunteering at the community center. She couldn't work full-time anymore, her health wouldn't allow it, but she could teach English to immigrants, help with homework tutoring, organize donation drives. The center couldn't pay her, but they offered something more valuable: purpose. Bernard joined her, using his business background to help low-income families with financial literacy, teaching them how to budget, how to avoid predatory loans, how to plan for emergencies. It was ironic, really. They'd lost everything, yet they were teaching others how to build financial security. "We're good at this," the center director, a woman named Grace, told them one afternoon. "You two have a gift for connecting with people." "We understand them," Yvonne said simply. "We live what they live." Grace studied them thoughtfully. "Have you ever considered that your experience, as painful as it's been, has given you something valuable: perspective, empathy, authority to speak to people who are struggling because you've struggled too?" It was a generous reframing of their trauma, but there was truth in it. 5 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne were different people. Physically, they'd aged beyond their years. Bernard walked with a cane now. Yvonne's arthritis had worsened. They both carried the weight of hardship in their faces, in their bodies. But spiritually, emotionally, they'd grown in ways they never expected. They'd learned gratitude for small things: a warm meal, a kind word, a sunny day. They'd learned that material wealth and human worth were not the same thing. They'd learned that they were stronger together than they'd ever been comfortable. "Do you ever think about reaching out to Julian?" Yvonne asked one night. It was a question she'd asked before, though Bernard always gave the same answer. "No, he made his choice. If he wants to find us, he knows how. He doesn't know where we live." "He could find out if he cared to look." Bernard's voice was firm. "We're not hard to find. Same city, same last name. If he wanted to make amends, he could." But Julian didn't want to make amends. That much was clear. Through the years, they'd occasionally seen updates about him online. Photos from charity galas, articles about his business success, society page mentions of his lifestyle. He'd sold their old house for $2.3 million and bought a penthouse downtown. His company had gone public. He was worth an estimated $50 million now, and he'd never once tried to find his parents. 6 years after being kicked out, something unexpected happened. Grace at the community center called Bernard and Yvonne into her office. "I have a proposition for you both. The city is launching a new program: peer support for elderly residents facing housing insecurity. They need counselors, people who understand the system from the inside. It would be paid positions." "How much?" Bernard asked carefully. He'd learned not to hope too much. $35,000 a year each, plus benefits, including health insurance. Yvonne gasped. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than they'd had in 6 years. And health insurance, that alone was transformative. "Why us?" Bernard asked, still cautious. "Because you've lived it," Grace said simply. "You can speak to people facing eviction, homelessness, poverty, not from a textbook, but from experience. You have credibility that no social work degree can provide." They accepted immediately. The job changed their lives again. Not back to what they'd once had. They'd never have that again. But to something stable, something sustainable. They could afford a slightly better apartment, regular meals, Yvonne's medications without rationing. More importantly, the work gave them meaning. Every person they helped, every family they guided through crisis was a small act of redemption. They couldn't change their own past, but they could help others avoid their fate. 7 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne attended a conference on homelessness prevention. They were presenting a workshop on their peer counseling program when Bernard saw him across the hotel lobby. Julian. He was older, grayer at the temples, but unmistakably their son. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Bernard's yearly salary and was laughing with a group of people who radiated wealth and privilege. Bernard's first instinct was to approach him. 7 years had dulled the sharp edges of his anger. Maybe they could talk. Maybe. Then Julian looked directly at Bernard. Their eyes met across the crowded lobby, and Julian turned away. It wasn't an accidental turn. It wasn't confusion or failure to recognize. It was deliberate, intentional erasure. Julian had seen his father and chosen to pretend he didn't exist. Bernard felt the rejection like a physical blow. After 7 years, some part of him had still hoped, still believed that maybe Julian felt remorse, felt guilt, felt something. But there was nothing, just calculated indifference. Bernard. Yvonne appeared at his side, following his gaze. She saw Julian too. Oh. They watched as their son disappeared into the conference rooms, surrounded by his wealthy friends, living a life that had no room for aging parents in cheap suits. "Let's go," Yvonne said quietly, taking Bernard's arm. "We have a workshop to present." They gave their workshop to a room full of social workers and nonprofit leaders. They shared their story, not all of it, not the part about Julian, but enough to illustrate the systemic failures that pushed elderly people into poverty. The audience was moved. Several people approached them afterward with questions, with offers to collaborate, with genuine admiration for their resilience. "You two are remarkable," one woman said. "To go through what you've experienced and still dedicate yourselves to helping others, that's true strength." After she walked away, Yvonne turned to Bernard. "Do you believe that? That we're strong?" "I believe we're survivors," Bernard replied. "Whether that's the same as strong, I don't know." That night, in their hotel room, a rare luxury paid for by the conference, they lay in the darkness and processed seeing Julian. "It doesn't hurt as much as I expected," Yvonne admitted. "Is that strange?" "No," Bernard said. "I think we've been grieving him for 7 years. Seeing him today just confirmed what we already knew. That he's gone. That he was never really ours to begin with." 8 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne's peer counseling program expanded citywide. They trained other counselors, developed curriculum, spoke at conferences. They became minor experts in their field, not because of degrees or credentials, but because of lived experience. They also became something else, truly happy. Not happy in the carefree way they'd been decades ago, before loss and betrayal, but happy in a deeper, more resilient way. They'd been broken and had rebuilt themselves. They'd lost everything and had found what actually mattered: each other, community, purpose. "Do you miss it?" Bernard asked Yvonne one evening. They were in their small but comfortable apartment. They'd moved to a better neighborhood 2 years ago. The old life? Yvonne considered the question seriously. "I miss the security, the comfort. I miss not worrying about money every day. But I don't miss who we were. We were comfortable people living comfortable lives. We never questioned anything, never pushed ourselves, never really understood the world most people live in. And now we do." "And now we do," Yvonne agreed. "I wouldn't choose what happened to us, but I can't regret what we've become because of it." 9 years after being kicked out, Bernard received a phone call from a lawyer. "Mr. Chen, I'm calling about an inheritance matter. Your aunt in Singapore has passed away, and you're listed as a beneficiary." Bernard had barely known his aunt, his father's sister who'd immigrated decades ago. They'd exchanged cards at holidays, but little else. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Bernard said, "but I should tell you I don't have money for any estate fees or—" "Actually, sir, the estate will be paying you. Your aunt's will specifies that you receive $500,000. Bernard was certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" 500,000. The estate is quite substantial, and she divided it among several family members. You'll need to fill out some paperwork, but the funds should be available within 6 weeks. After he hung up, Bernard sat in stunned silence. Yvonne emerged from the kitchen. Who was that? A lawyer. My Aunt May died. She left me $500,000. Yvonne sank into the chair across from him, equally stunned. $500,000. It was more money than they'd seen in 9 years, more money than they'd ever expected to see again. What do we do with it? Bernard asked. They spent weeks discussing the question. The money could buy them so much, a better apartment, a car, travel, all the comforts they'd lost. But in the end, they made a different choice. They kept $100,000 for themselves, enough to create a genuine emergency fund and upgrade their living situation modestly. The remaining $400,000 they used to establish a foundation, the Second Chances Fund, dedicated to preventing elderly homelessness and providing support to seniors estranged from family. This is what Aunt May would have wanted, Bernard said as they signed the paperwork. She was estranged from most of the family too. She understood. The foundation became their legacy, the good they could do with wealth that dwarfed anything they'd achieved with their old business. 10 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne were invited to speak at a national conference on aging and poverty. They stood before an audience of hundreds, policymakers, advocates, researchers, and told their story. Not hiding the shame of homelessness, not softening the reality of their son's betrayal, but laying it all bare. We were educated, hard-working people, Bernard said. We thought we'd done everything right, but one bad decision, trusting our son, cost us everything. The system failed us at every point, Yvonne continued. There were no safety nets for people like us, no support, no recognition that anyone, regardless of their history, can fall into poverty. They outlined the structural changes needed: better tenant protections, elder abuse enforcement, asset limits on senior benefits that didn't punish people for modest savings. The audience gave them a standing ovation. Afterward, in the hotel bar, they sat with other advocates and nonprofit leaders discussing strategy and collaboration. That's when Bernard saw him again. Julian had been at the conference. Of course he had. He was on the board of a prominent nonprofit, probably for the tax benefits and social status. This time, Julian approached them. "Hello," he said awkwardly, standing at their table. Bernard and Yvonne looked up at their son, this stranger who'd once been their whole world. "Julian," Bernard said neutrally. "I heard your presentation. It was—" Julian trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "Powerful. Thank you." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "I didn't know," Julian finally said, "about what happened to you, that you were homeless?" Bernard felt anger flash through him. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. We weren't exactly hiding. I assumed you'd be fine, that you'd figure something out." "We did figure something out," Yvonne said quietly. "We survived, no thanks to you." Julian flinched. "I came over to apologize for how things ended between us." "For how things ended?" Bernard repeated incredulously. "You kicked us out of our home with no notice and no resources. You didn't just end things, you destroyed them." "I was focused on the business. You were focused on yourself," Bernard interrupted. "On your wealth, your status, your comfort. We were inconvenient, so you discarded us." Julian's face reddened. "I'm trying to apologize here." "No, you're trying to feel better about yourself," Yvonne said, her voice sharp. "You saw us on that stage, successful despite what you did to us, and now your guilt is finally bothering you." "It's been bothering me for years," Julian protested. Not enough to actually do anything about it, Bernard pointed out. You saw me at a conference 3 years ago. You looked right at me and turned away. Julian's expression confirmed it was true. I was ashamed. So you let shame prevent you from making amends? Yvonne shook her head. That's cowardice, not regret. What do you want from me? Julian asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I'm here now. I'm apologizing. Bernard studied his son, this man who'd broken their hearts and their lives. Even now, Julian didn't really understand. He thought an apology could erase 10 years of suffering, of struggle, of feeling worthless and abandoned. I don't want anything from you, Bernard said finally. That's the truth, Julian. We don't need your money. We don't need your apology. We don't need you. Dad, you made that choice 10 years ago, Bernard continued. You decided we were disposable. Well, we've built a new life now. We've found new purpose. We're happy, genuinely happy. And you have no part in that happiness. Julian looked stricken. You're saying you don't forgive me? I'm saying forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation, Yvonne said softly. Maybe someday we'll forgive you, but that doesn't mean we want you in our lives. You're my parents. We were your parents, Bernard corrected. We loved you, sacrificed for you, would have done anything for you. And you threw us away like garbage. Now we're strangers who happen to share DNA. Julian's eyes filled with tears. Perhaps they were genuine. Perhaps he truly felt remorse. But it was too late. I hope you have a good life, Julian, Yvonne said, standing. I genuinely do. But we won't be part of it. They walked away from their son for the second time, but this time they were the ones making the choice. Later that night, in their hotel room, Bernard and Yvonne held each other. Did we do the right thing? Yvonne asked, turning him away. I don't know, Bernard admitted, but it felt right. It felt like protecting ourselves. He seemed genuinely sorry. Maybe he was. But sorry doesn't undo 10 years of suffering. It doesn't heal the wounds or restore what was lost. Yvonne was quiet for a long moment. I think what I realized is that we don't owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not another chance. We gave him chance after chance when he was growing up. We gave him everything we had. He chose to waste it. And we chose to survive, Bernard said. That's our triumph, not his. They fell asleep holding hands, as they had every night for 10 years, through shelters and tiny apartments, through poverty and rebuilding, through loss and hard-won happiness. 3 months after the conference, Bernard and Yvonne received a letter. It was from Julian, handwritten rather than typed. Dear Mom and Dad, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to respond. But I need to say these things, even if only for myself. You were right at the conference. I was trying to feel better about myself rather than genuinely making amends. I wanted your forgiveness because it would ease my guilt, not because I'd earned it. I've spent the past 3 months really thinking about what I did to you. Not just kicking you out, that was the obvious cruelty, but all the years before. The distance I maintained, the contempt I showed for anything that wasn't about money or status, the way I took everything you gave me and never said thank you. I don't know when I became the person I am. I don't remember a specific moment when I decided wealth mattered more than people. It was gradual, insidious. Each choice seemed small at the time, but they added up to something monstrous. You said at the conference that the system failed you, but I failed you worse. I was supposed to be your safety net. Instead, I pushed you off the cliff. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I've started therapy. I've begun making changes to how I do business, treating employees better, paying fair wages, creating actual value rather than just extracting it. I've also endowed a fund at Your Second Chances Foundation. $2 million, no strings attached, anonymously as far as the public is concerned. It's not enough. It could never be enough. But it's something. I hope your life continues to be filled with the happiness and purpose you found. You deserved better than the son you got, but you built something beautiful anyway. With regret and love, Julian. Bernard set down the letter, his hands shaking. "What do you think?" Yvonne asked. She'd read it twice, her expression unreadable. "I think he means it," Bernard said slowly. "This time, I think he actually means it." Does that change anything? Bernard considered the question. Did it change anything? Julian had betrayed them profoundly, left them to suffer, ignored them for years. A letter and a donation couldn't erase that. But people could change. Bernard and Yvonne had changed, transformed by hardship into deeper, more empathetic versions of themselves. Maybe Julian was capable of transformation too. "I don't know," Bernard admitted. "Maybe we could respond. Not reconcile, not yet, but acknowledge his effort." Yvonne nodded slowly. "We could write back. Tell him we appreciate the fund and the sentiment. That we're willing to see if his changes are genuine. No promises," Bernard added. "No pressure. Just an opening." "Just an opening," Yvonne agreed. They wrote a brief letter in response. "Julian, we received your letter. Thank you for your honesty and for the donation to the foundation. We're not ready for reconciliation. The wounds are too deep, the betrayal too profound. But we're willing to see if your transformation is real and lasting. If you're serious about change, prove it through actions, not words. Treat people with dignity. Use your wealth to build rather than exploit. Be the person we once believed you could be. If you do those things consistently, for years, not months, perhaps someday we can revisit the question of what our relationship might look like. Until then, we wish you well on your journey." Bernard and Yvonne. They mailed it and tried not to think about it too much. Life went on. The foundation flourished. Bernard and Yvonne continued their counseling work, touching more lives, making more differences. Months passed. Then a year. Julian didn't respond to their letter, but they occasionally saw news about his company. Employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. He'd implemented profit-sharing programs. He'd spoken publicly about the need for ethical business practices. Maybe he was changing, maybe not. Time would tell. 2 years after the conference confrontation, Bernard and Yvonne were invited to the governor's mansion to receive an award for their advocacy work. It was a surreal evening. Them, 2 people who'd been homeless just over a decade ago, standing in opulent rooms, being honored by powerful people. During the reception, a young woman approached them. She was maybe 30, professionally dressed, with kind eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen? I'm Nora. I work for your son's company." Bernard tensed immediately. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing wrong. I just wanted to thank you. When Julian, Mr. Chen, implemented the new workplace policies, he told us about you, about what he'd done, what he'd learned. He said he was trying to honor the values you taught him, even though he'd forgotten them for so long." She smiled. "Those policies changed my life. I was barely making ends meet, working a second job, about to lose my apartment. The wage increase and profit sharing meant I could quit my second job, go back to school, build a real future." "We're glad to hear that," Yvonne said carefully. "I'm one of hundreds of employees he's helped, and I thought you should know. He's not doing it for publicity or tax breaks. He's doing it quietly, consistently. He's really trying to be better." Nora paused. "I know I don't know your history with him, but whatever it is, I thought you'd want to know he's making a difference." After she left, Bernard and Yvonne looked at each other. 2 years of consistent change, Yvonne murmured. "It's a start," Bernard agreed. "Just a start. But it was something." 5 years after the conference, 15 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne received a call. Julian had collapsed at work, heart attack. He was in the hospital, stable but serious. "Should we go?" Yvonne asked. It was the question that had no easy answer. They'd maintained minimal contact with Julian over the past 5 years, brief emails a few times a year, acknowledgement of the continued good work his company was doing, but they hadn't seen him, hadn't reconciled. "I think we should," Bernard said finally, "not because we owe him, but because we owe ourselves, so we don't wonder what if." At the hospital, they found Julian in a private room, hooked to various monitors. At 55, he looked older than his years, stress and guilt, and finally, perhaps, wisdom. "You came," he said, his voice weak. "We did," Bernard replied, sitting in the visitor's chair. Yvonne took the other chair. "I didn't expect you to." "We didn't expect to," Yvonne admitted, "but here we are." Julian closed his eyes. "I have something to tell you, something I should have said years ago." "What's that?" "I was wrong. About everything. About what mattered. About who I wanted to be." Julian opened his eyes, and they were filled with tears. "I was a monster to you. I destroyed everything good in pursuit of money that brought me no real happiness." "We know," Bernard said quietly. "We've known for years." "But you came anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Bernard exchanged a glance with Yvonne. Why had they come? After everything, after 15 years of pain and rebuilding, why were they sitting in this hospital room? "Because we heard you've been trying," Bernard said finally, "really trying, not just performing. And we believe in redemption, Julian. We have to. We've been redeeming ourselves for 15 years. "Redeeming yourselves? From what?" Julian asked, confused. "I'm the one who—" "From bitterness," Yvonne interrupted, "from hatred, from letting what you did to us define who we became. We had to work very hard not to let your cruelty make us cruel." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "Did you succeed?" "Mostly," Bernard said. "We're not perfect. We're still angry sometimes, still hurt. But we built something good from the ashes. That's our redemption." "And mine is still in progress," Yvonne said. "You can't erase 15 years of suffering with 5 years of better behavior, but you can build a future that's different from your past." "I want to build that future with you," Julian said. "Not like before. I know we can't go back, but maybe we could build something new, something honest." Bernard felt the old wariness rise up. This was how it started before: promises, hope, trust, and then betrayal. But people could change. Bernard and Yvonne were living proof of that. "Well, think about it," Bernard said. "But Julian, you need to understand something. If we do this, if we let you back into our lives in any capacity, it's not going to be like it was. We're not your parents in the old sense. We're separate people who share a history." "I understand." "And trust will be earned slowly," Yvonne added, "in tiny increments, over years." "I understand that too," Julian said. "I'll earn it, however long it takes." They stayed for an hour, talking carefully about neutral subjects: the foundation's work, Julian's company projects, the state of the world. It was awkward and formal, but it was a start. As they were leaving, Julian called out, "Wait!" They turned. "Thank you," he said, simply, "for coming, for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it." "No," Bernard agreed, "you don't. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we all deserve the chance to become better than we've been." Over the following years, Bernard, Yvonne, and Julian slowly, cautiously rebuilt something that resembled a relationship. It wasn't what they'd once had. That innocent parent-child bond was gone, destroyed by Julian's betrayal. But it was something new, built on honesty and realistic expectations. They had dinner once a month. Julian volunteered at the foundation. He listened to their stories, really listened, and let their experiences shape his understanding of the world. He also continued his business reforms, turning his company into a model of ethical practices. He spoke publicly about his past failures, using his own story to advocate for change in how businesses treated employees and communities. It was redemption in action, not just in words. 20 years after being kicked out, Bernard and Yvonne stood before another audience at another conference. They were in their late 80s now, showing every year of their age, but they were still working, still advocating, still making differences. 20 years ago, Bernard began, my son kicked us out of our home. We became homeless, destitute, forgotten. We thought our lives were over. But we were wrong, Yvonne continued. Our old lives were over, but new lives were beginning. Lives with more meaning, more purpose, more genuine connection than we'd ever had before. We lost everything, Bernard said, and in losing everything, we found what actually mattered. They spoke about the foundation, now in its 13th year, which had helped over 10,000 seniors avoid or escape homelessness. They spoke about systemic changes they'd helped advocate for. They spoke about the community they'd built. And then Bernard said something unexpected. Our son is here today. Julian, would you stand up? In the audience, Julian stood, looking nervous. Julian destroyed our lives 20 years ago, Bernard continued. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that he spent the past 10 years genuinely trying to become a better person, to make amends, to use his privilege and power to help rather than harm. We haven't fully reconciled, Yvonne added. Maybe we never will. The wounds are too deep. But we've built something new. Not a restoration of what was lost, but a creation of something honest. And that's enough, Bernard finished. It has to be enough. After the presentation, Julian approached them. Thank you, he said quietly, for acknowledging my efforts. I know it's not easy. It's not, Bernard agreed. But it's true. You have been trying. That matters. Julian hesitated, then said, I have something to tell you. Stephanie and I are adopting a child, a daughter from China. Bernard and Yvonne exchanged surprised glances. We've been in the process for 2 years, Julian continued. I wanted to wait to tell you until it was certain. She's 3 years old. Her name is May, after your aunt. Julian, Yvonne breathed. I want to do better by her than I did by you, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. I want to teach her about kindness and empathy, and that people matter more than possessions. I want her to know her grandparents, if you're willing. It was a question, not an assumption. Julian had learned that much at least. Bernard felt tears streaming down his face. A grandchild. After everything, after 20 years of pain and rebuilding, they might have a grandchild. We'd like that, he said, very much. 3 months later, they met little May for the first time. She was tiny, delicate, with curious eyes and a shy smile. She clung to Julian at first, uncertain of these elderly strangers. But Bernard and Yvonne had learned patience. They sat on the floor of Julian's living room, not the penthouse, he'd sold that years ago for something more modest, and let May come to them at her own pace. Eventually she did. She showed them her toys, her books, her favorite stuffed animal. And when she climbed into Yvonne's lap and fell asleep, Bernard saw his wife's face transform with a joy he hadn't seen in decades. She's beautiful, Yvonne whispered. She is, Julian agreed. And I'm terrified of failing her the way I failed you. You will fail her sometimes, Bernard said honestly. All parents fail their children. The question is whether you learn from those failures or let them define you. I'm trying to learn. Then you're already doing better than you did with us, Yvonne said gently. It wasn't forgiveness, not complete, probably never complete, but it was grace. And perhaps grace was more valuable than forgiveness anyway. 22 years after being kicked out, Bernard's health began to fail. His body, pushed beyond its limits by years of poverty and stress, was finally giving out. The doctors were gentle but honest. He had months, maybe a year. "I'm not afraid," he told Yvonne. "I've had a good life. Not easy, but good." "The best parts came after we lost everything," Yvonne reflected. "That's true," Bernard agreed. "Losing everything stripped away all the nonsense, all the pretension and materialism and status seeking. It left us with what was real. Each other." "Each other," Bernard confirmed, "and a purpose bigger than ourselves." His final months were spent surrounded by love. Yvonne, always at his side. Julian, visiting regularly with little May. The community they'd built through the foundation, stopping by to share stories and gratitude. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, with Yvonne holding his hand and sunlight streaming through the window of their small but comfortable apartment, Bernard Chen died peacefully. At his funeral, the church was packed. There were foundation staff and board members, former clients whose lives had been changed, advocates and policymakers they'd worked with, neighbors from their building, people from the homeless shelter where they'd spent their first nights after being kicked out. And there was Julian, standing at the podium, struggling to speak through tears. "My father was a better man than I deserved," he said. "I destroyed him, destroyed my mother, threw them away like they meant nothing. And somehow, impossibly, he found a way to let me back into his life. Not fully, never fully. I'd broken too much for that. But enough." He looked at Yvonne in the front row, holding 5-year-old May. "He taught me, in the end, that wealth without character is worthless." That power without compassion is cruelty. That the true measure of a life is who you lift up, not how high you climb. I learned those lessons too late to give him the son he deserved. But maybe, with my daughter, I can honor his memory by being the father he tried to teach me to be. After the funeral, as people were leaving, a young man approached Yvonne. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Daniel. You probably don't remember me." Yvonne studied him. There was something familiar. "The shelter," she said suddenly. 15 years ago. You were the night clerk." Daniel smiled. "I was. You and Mr. Chen were so kind to everyone, even when you had nothing. You encouraged me to go back to school." "And did you?" "I did. I got my degree in social work. Now I run a housing program for homeless youth." He paused. "Your husband changed my life. I wanted you to know that." After he left, Yvonne sat alone in the church, letting the memories wash over her. 22 years. A lifetime compressed into 2 decades of extremes. Devastating loss, gradual rebuilding, hard-won wisdom, imperfect reconciliation. Had it been worth it? The suffering, the struggle, the years of poverty and hardship? No, she wouldn't choose it. Given the chance to go back and change things, she'd prevent it all in a heartbeat. But since she couldn't change the past, she had to find meaning in it. And the meaning was this: they'd survived. More than survived, they'd transformed their suffering into purpose, their pain into empathy, their loss into a legacy that would outlive them both. Bernard had taught her that, even at the end, especially at the end. Yvonne stood, taking May's hand. "Come, sweetheart, let's go home." "I miss Grandpa," May said in her small voice. "I do too," Yvonne replied. "But he's not really gone. He lives on in all the people he helped, in the foundation we built, in you." They walked out of the church together into the bright sunshine. Julian waited by the car, looking lost. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "would you and May like to come to our house for dinner?" Yvonne considered it. 22 years ago, she'd lost her home and her son. Now she had a small apartment and an imperfect relationship with that same son. It wasn't what she'd once had, but it was real, honest, built on truth rather than assumptions. Yes, she said, we'd like that. As they drove through the city, past the old shelter, past the building where they'd lived in that tiny studio, past the community center where they'd found purpose, Yvonne reflected on the shocking truth of their journey. Sometimes losing everything is the beginning, not the end. Sometimes betrayal leads to redemption. Sometimes the people who destroy us can learn to rebuild. And sometimes the life you never wanted becomes the life that saves you. 22 years after being kicked out, Yvonne Chen finally understood. They hadn't lost everything that day. They'd lost their illusions, their comfortable blindness, their false sense of security. But they'd found truth, community, purpose, love that was tested and proven real. And in the end, that was everything.